My daughter-in-law waited until after my son's funeral to try and steal my home, handing me an eviction notice while her sympathy cards were still on my mantelpiece. She thought she had inherited everything. She didn't know my son had left me one last gift: the legal power to watch her pack her bags. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know, I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. The silence in my house on Sycamore Street was a new and unwelcome resident. It had moved in the day we buried my son Randall, and it had made itself thoroughly at home, seeping into the floral wallpaper, settling like dust on the cherished books in my late husband's study, and filling the space beside me in the bed I now shared only with memories. At 70, I had thought I was well acquainted with grief, having lost my beloved George 5 years prior. I was wrong. The loss of a child is a grief of a different, more brutal texture. It is an inversion of the natural order, a wound that doesn't just ache but hollows you out from the inside. My son Randall had been a good man with his father's kind eyes and a quiet, steady strength. His sudden heart attack at 48 had been a shock to us all, a cruel tear in the fabric of our family. Now all that was left of him in this house was his memory and his widow Nicole. At 40 she was a vision of sleek, modern elegance, even in her mourning attire. Her grief, however, felt performative. It was a well-rehearsed production of sighs and dabbed eyes, but her gaze, when she thought I wasn't looking, was sharp, appraising. She moved through the rooms of my home, the home where I had raised Randall from a boy, not with the sorrow of a widow retracing her husband's steps, but with the cool, calculating eye of an estate appraiser. She'd run a perfectly manicured finger along the mahogany sideboard, not to feel the connection to the past, but to assess its value. She'd stare out at my garden, not at the roses Randall had helped me plant, but at the square footage of the lot. In the days immediately following the funeral, while my heart was still a raw, open wound and kind neighbors brought by casseroles that sat uneaten, Nicole was on the phone, her voice a low, efficient murmur. I'd catch snippets from the hallway. Yes, we'll need to liquidate some of the older assets. No, there's no sentimental value to speak of. It's all about streamlining for the future. Her future. Not ours. Not mine. She treated my grief as an inconvenient temporary state that was delaying the inevitable and, for her, more important business of settling Randall's estate. Pauline, she'd say, her voice laced with a brittle, false sympathy, I know this is hard for you, but we must be practical. Randall would have wanted us to be practical. Practical. That was her word for it. My son was barely cold in the ground and his wife was already liquidating his memory. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that Randall was more than assets on a spreadsheet, that this house was more than just property. But my grief was a heavy cloak, smothering my anger, leaving me weary and silent. I retreated into myself, into my memories, finding solace in the quiet dignity of my sorrow. Nicole mistook my silence for weakness, my grief for senility. She began to take over the house with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. She moved her things into Randall's old study, his father's study, boxing up his cherished collection of vintage jazz records with a brisk, dismissive air. So much clutter, Pauline, she'd commented, seeing me watching from the doorway. We need a clean slate to move forward. She started having friends over, women as sleek and hard-edged as herself. Their laughter felt like a violation in my quiet, mourning home. They'd drink wine in my living room, their voices sharp, discussing property values and stock portfolios, while I sat in the kitchen, a ghost at my own table, listening to the echoes of a life that was rapidly being erased. One afternoon I found Nicole in the master bedroom, our bedroom, with a tape measure, her phone pressed to her ear. No, the whole wall will have to go, she was saying. I'm thinking a walk-in closet, very minimalist. And the old wallpaper is just dreadful, it has to be stripped immediately. She saw me standing there and didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. She simply smiled, a thin, tight smile. Just getting some ideas, Pauline. Planning for the future. You understand. I understood all too well. The future she was planning had no room for me, no room for my memories, no room for the life George and I and our son had built within these walls. In her eyes, I was just another piece of old, outdated furniture to be cleared out to make way for her new modern aesthetic. My son, my Randall. Had he not seen this side of her? This cold, grasping avarice? Or had he seen it and chosen to ignore it, blinded by her beauty, by her sophisticated airs? It was a question that tormented me in the long, lonely nights. Had I lost my son long before his heart gave out? The atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive with each passing day. Nicole's initial pretense of sympathy vanished completely, replaced by an open impatience. She would sigh dramatically if I was slow coming down the stairs, make pointed comments about the cost of utilities, ask me when I was planning to sort through Randall's old things. She was a cuckoo in my nest, systematically pushing me out, making me feel like an intruder in the only home I had ever known. I knew a confrontation was coming. I could feel it building, a storm on the horizon. But I was tired, so terribly tired, my energy consumed by a grief that was still too new, too raw. I clung to the hope that some flicker of decency, some shred of respect for her late husband's mother, would eventually surface in Nicole. It was a foolish hope, I see now. For some people, grief is just a brief, inconvenient pause before the vultures descend to pick over the remains. And Nicole, I was beginning to realize, was the most patient and the most predatory of them all. The air in my own home had become thin, difficult to breathe. It had been just over a week since we buried Randall, a week that felt like a year, a week of Nicole systematically erasing my life and my son's memory from the very walls that had held them. Her phone calls were no longer hushed. She now spoke openly of realtors and renovations, her voice ringing with a triumphant ownership that made my blood run cold. She treated me with a polite, dismissive cruelty that was in its own way more painful than outright rage. I was a problem to be managed, a piece of old furniture that hadn't yet been moved to the curb. I had retreated into myself, my grief a fragile shield. I spent most of my days in Randall's old bedroom, sitting in the armchair by the window, holding one of his old worn sweaters, trying to recall the scent of him, the sound of his laughter, anything to drown out the sound of Nicole downstairs, planning the dismantling of my world. The confrontation I had been dreading arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a gray, drizzly day, the sky weeping a sorrow that mirrored my own. I was in the living room looking through an old photo album, my fingers tracing the faded image of a gap-toothed 7-year-old Randall on his first day of school. Nicole entered the room not with her usual brisk energy, but with a strange, almost theatrical solemnity. She was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. "Pauline," she began, her voice devoid of any real emotion, "we need to talk." I looked up from the photo album, my heart giving a slow, heavy thud. "What is it, Nicole?" She didn't sit. She stood before me, a judge before a condemned prisoner. "I know this is a difficult time for you," she said, the words a hollow, rehearsed script. "But as you know, Randall and I discussed our future extensively. And now that he's gone, I have a responsibility to honor those plans and to secure my own future." She placed the envelope on the coffee table between us with a soft, definitive thud. "We must be practical." Practical. That word again. The word she used to justify her every cruel, selfish impulse. I stared at the envelope. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I asked, though a cold, terrifying certainty was already beginning to form in my gut. "It's a formality, really," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "As you know, this was Randall's house. He inherited it from his father, and now as his widow it passes to me. This document just clarifies the legal transition of the property. It's a formal notice to quit the premises." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the words. Notice to quit. Eviction. She was evicting me. From my own home. From the house I had moved into as a young bride, the house where I had raised my son, the house where I had mourned my husband, the house that held every memory I cherished. You are throwing me out?" I whispered, the words feeling alien, impossible. "I wouldn't put it so crudely, Pauline," she said, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "I'm simply settling my late husband's estate as is my right. And frankly, this house is far too large for one person. It's not practical for you. And I," she added, a note of triumph in her voice, "have plans for it. Plans Randall and I made together." Why? A bald-faced, monstrous lie. Randall would never have agreed to throw his own mother out of her home. Never. "The notice gives you 60 days to make other arrangements," she continued, her gaze now as hard and cold as a winter sky. "I believe that is more than generous under the circumstances. Of course, you may take your personal belongings within reason. I'll be having an appraiser come through next week for the rest of the contents. My mind reeled. The audacity, the sheer breathtaking cruelty of it. A week after his funeral, while his memory was still a fresh, gaping wound in my heart. She was not just evicting me, she was liquidating my life, my history for her own greedy ends. Nicole, I said, my voice trembling, a desperate plea rising in my throat. You can't do this. This is my home. This was Randall's home. His father built that bookshelf with his own 2 hands. Randall planted that oak tree in the front yard when he was just a boy. These aren't just contents, they are our lives. She looked at me then with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity, the kind a queen might bestow upon a particularly pathetic peasant. Pauline, she said, her voice dripping with a condescension that was almost worse than her cruelty, you are a very sentimental woman. And sentimentality has no place in practical matters. The law is the law. The house is mine. I suggest you start looking at apartments. Perhaps something more manageable for a woman of your years. She turned then, her work apparently done, leaving the thick cream envelope on the table, a formal declaration of war on my grieving heart. The silence she left behind was profound, broken only by the frantic, panicked beating of my own heart. I felt the floor give way beneath me, the world tilting on its axis. My son was gone. My husband was gone. And now my home, my sanctuary, my last connection to the life I had known, was being stolen from me by the woman who bore my son's name. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at that envelope, a symbol of Nicole's utter, monstrous betrayal. The grief for Randall was still there, a raw, constant ache. But now it was joined by a new, terrifying emotion. Fear. I was 70 years old, a widow with a modest pension, and I was about to be homeless. But as the initial shock began to recede, as the terror began to give way to a cold, hard knot of reality, another feeling, one I hadn't felt in a very long time, began to stir in the depths of my soul. It was a flicker of the old Pauline, the one who had faced down life's storms before, the one who had raised a son alone, who had managed a household, who had always found a way. It was a flicker of pure, unyielding rage. She thought she could do this. She thought I was just a sentimental old woman who would crumble and fade away. She thought the law was on her side. That night, after Nicole had gone to bed, likely dreaming of renovations and real estate values, I did not weep. I did not pray. I walked with a new, steady purpose to the back of my late husband's study. I ran my fingers along the spines of his old law books, a strange comfort. Then I knelt with some difficulty and pulled up the loose floorboard behind his desk, a spot only he and I had ever known about. From the small dark space I retrieved an old dusty lockbox. My hands were no longer shaking. They were steady, as I remembered something. Something from long ago. A practical matter, a legal matter that Nicole, in all her arrogant, greedy calculations, had overlooked. A truth that had been lying dormant for decades, waiting for this very moment. The house was silent, wrapped in the deep, unbreathing quiet of the early morning hours. Nicole slept soundly in my marital bed, no doubt dreaming of the new life she was so ruthlessly carving out for herself. She had won, she believed. She had delivered the final, decisive blow to the sentimental old woman who stood in the way of her inheritance. But victory, I knew, was a matter of perspective. And she had no idea that I, in my grief and my supposed obsolescence, was about to consult a history she had completely ignored. My own history. The old lockbox sat on the polished surface of my late husband George's desk, a stark utilitarian object in the moonlit study. This metal was cool and unyielding beneath my fingertips. Inside lay the mundane artifacts of a life. My own birth certificate, George's honorable discharge papers from the army, a lock of Randall's baby hair, so soft and blonde, tied with a faded blue ribbon. My heart ached. I pushed past these relics of a softer time, my fingers searching for a thicker, more substantial document. And then I found it. It was a heavy sheaf of paper, folded and bound with a brittle rubber band. The heading, in the familiar, slightly archaic font of legal documents from that era, was clear: Quitclaim Deed. The date, April 23, 1997. My hands, which had been so steady just moments before, began to tremble with a mixture of sorrow and a fierce, rising vindication. The memories of that year, 1997, came flooding back with a startling, painful clarity. Randall had been in his early 20s then, bright, ambitious, and just a little too reckless. He had started his first real business, a small construction company fueled by more passion than capital. To secure a crucial line of credit, he had, against his father's advice, used this very house, his childhood home, as collateral. George and I were co-owners then, the deed in both our names. Then came the recession of the early 2000s. The construction business faltered, clients defaulted, and suddenly the bank was calling, threatening to foreclose. We stood to lose everything. George was devastated, but Randall was crushed by the weight of his own youthful hubris, the fear that his ambition had destroyed his family's security. It was I who had remained calm. I had a small inheritance from my parents, money I had kept separate, my own rainy day fund. I had used it to negotiate with the bank to settle the debt and save our home. But my act of salvation had come with a non-negotiable condition, insisted upon by our then young lawyer. To protect the home from any of Randall's future business follies, and to legally acknowledge that my separate premarital funds had saved it, the ownership structure had to change. George, ever my loving partner, had agreed without hesitation. And Randall, humbled and grateful, had signed the paperwork. The house was legally transferred through this quitclaim deed solely and entirely to me, Pauline Hayes. It was my property, my asset, to do with as I pleased, forever protected from the debts or claims of any spouse, child, or business partner. We had never changed it back. As Randall's business later flourished, as he married Nicole, as he became the successful man he was before his untimely death, the deed remained a quiet, forgotten fact. It was a measure taken in a time of crisis. A crisis we had overcome. Randall, I know, saw it as a permanent guarantee of my security, a testament to his love and his youthful lesson learned. He likely never even told Nicole the specific details of the ownership, assuming it was a settled matter, a loving arrangement that would only ever matter upon my own passing. He never could have imagined his own wife would try to use his death to evict his mother from the very home he had ensured was legally hers. Nicole, with her focus on the present, on appearances, on her own perceived rights as a widow, had seen only a house owned by her late husband. She had made a fatal, arrogant assumption. She had not done her due diligence. She had not done her research. A slow, cold smile touched my lips in the dim light of the study. She had served me a sham eviction notice based on a false premise. She had called me sentimental. But sentiment, I thought, was a luxury. This deed, this quiet, dusty document, was not sentiment. It was power. It was the law. And it was mine. I carefully placed the deed back in the lockbox, the righteous anger in my veins now a cool, clear river. The time for grieving, for quiet endurance, was over. The time for strategic action had begun. Nicole thought she was playing a simple game of chess against a pawn. She was about to discover she was playing against the queen. And the queen had just remembered where she had hidden her most powerful piece. I looked at the phone on my husband's desk. My first call would not be to a moving company, nor to a senior housing authority. It would be to my lawyer, a sharp, compassionate woman who understood both the letter of the law and the unwritten laws of justice. I would not be driven from my home. I would not be erased. I would not be another sentimental old woman swept aside by greed. I was Pauline Hayes, the sole legal owner of 12 Sycamore Street. And my daughter-in-law, Nicole Hayes, was no longer a resident in waiting. She was a trespasser. And it was high time she was served with an eviction notice of her own. A real one. The following morning, I bypassed my usual routine. The chicory coffee sat unbrewed, the newspaper unread. Instead, I dressed with a purpose I hadn't felt since before Randall's passing. I chose my best wool coat, a string of my mother's simple pearls, and my most sensible, comfortable shoes. In my large handbag, nestled beside my wallet and reading glasses, were two documents: Nicole's insulting, legally baseless eviction notice, and my own ironclad, decades-old deed to the house on Sycamore Street. My appointment was at 10. My lawyer, a woman named Ms. Albright, had been recommended by a friend from my old bridge club. "She's a shark, Pauline," my friend had whispered, "but a shark on the side of the angels." That was exactly what I needed. Her office was in a modern glass tower downtown, a world away from the familiar comfort of my neighborhood. But today I did not feel out of place. I walked through the sleek, minimalist lobby with my head held high, my steps measured and deliberate. I was not a victim seeking pity. I was a property owner seeking counsel. Ms. Albright was sharp, professional, her office immaculate, her gaze direct. She listened to my story without interruption, her expression transitioning from polite sympathy to a sort of quiet, focused indignation as I recounted the events of the past few weeks. I told her of Randall's sudden passing, of Nicole's cold, appraising behavior, and finally of the cruel theatrical presentation of the eviction notice while I was still deep in the throes of my most profound grief. "And she believes the house is hers as Randall's widow?" Ms. Albright clarified, her fingers steepled. "She believes it with an arrogance that is quite breathtaking," I confirmed. "She is currently in my home, planning renovations and, I suspect, its eventual sale." "I see," Ms. Albright said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "And you have the documentation you mentioned on the phone?" I slid the folder across her polished desk. She opened it, her eyes quickly scanning Nicole's notice. She let out a small, almost imperceptible scoff. "This is amateur hour, Mrs. Hayes," she said, setting it aside. "Poorly drafted, based on a completely false legal premise. An intimidation tactic, and a rather pathetic one at that." Then she picked up my deed, the quitclaim deed from 1997. She read it far more carefully, her eyes lingering on the signatures, the notary's stamp, the official county seal. She looked up at me, her professional demeanor softening for a moment with a look of genuine admiration. "Well, Pauline," she said, dropping the formal Mrs. Hayes. "Your ownership of this property is absolute, unencumbered, and from a legal standpoint as solid as bedrock. Your late son and husband had remarkable foresight. Nicole Hayes has absolutely no legal claim to this property. None whatsoever. She is, at this moment, residing in your home as a guest, and a rather unwelcome one at that." A wave of profound relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. I had known it deep down, but to hear it stated with such irrefutable legal authority was like a balm to my bruised soul. "So," I said, my voice steady, "what are my options?" "Your options are quite simple and entirely in your favor," Ms. Albright said, leaning forward. "First, we will draft a formal response to her notice. It will state in no uncertain terms that she has no legal standing and that her attempt to evict you constitutes harassment. Second, and more to the point, we will draft a formal, legally binding eviction notice of our own from you to her." She held up a hand as I was about to speak. "This document will give her the legally required 30 days to vacate your property. It will be official, served by a professional process server, and unassailable in court. If she fails to comply, we will proceed with having the sheriff physically remove her." The image of Nicole, with her expensive clothes and her smug sense of superiority, being escorted from my home by a uniformed sheriff was a satisfying one, I had to admit. "She will fight, of course," Ms. Albright continued. "She will likely claim coercion, or that your son had a verbal agreement with you. She might even try to contest your competency, a common and ugly tactic in these situations. But she has no proof, no standing. And we," she patted my deed, "have this. This is the foundation of our case, and it is unshakable." We spent the next hour discussing the details. Ms. Albright's team would handle everything, shielding me from any direct confrontation with Nicole. The eviction notice would be drafted, along with a cease and desist letter regarding any attempts by Nicole to alter or remove property from the house. "Pauline," Ms. Albright said as our meeting concluded, "you have been through a terrible ordeal at a time of profound grief. What your daughter-in-law has done is morally reprehensible. It will be my great professional pleasure to see that she is reminded of her true position in this matter." I stood to leave, feeling taller, stronger than I had in years. The grief for my son was still there, a constant, heavy presence. But it was no longer a paralyzing fog. It was now intertwined with a clear, cold sense of purpose. Nicole had tried to use the law as a weapon to terrorize me, to steal my home. But the law, when wielded with truth and conviction, was a shield. And I, Pauline Hayes, was about to watch as my arrogant, grasping daughter-in-law shattered her own greedy ambitions against it. I had walked into that office a grieving mother. I was walking out a plaintiff ready for battle. The days leading up to the service of the eviction notice were a strange, tense ballet in my own home. I moved with a quiet, almost serene composure, a stark contrast to Nicole's increasingly frantic and possessive energy. She had taken my silence, my lack of an emotional outburst after her cruel edict, as a sign of my complete and utter defeat. She had no idea it was the calm before a storm I was about to unleash. She spent her days on the phone with realtors, her voice a sharp, commanding staccato as she discussed listing prices and commission rates for my house. She had decorators come through, their arms laden with swatches of cold, minimalist fabrics, their talk of depersonalizing and staging for sale, a constant grating assault on my senses. I would sit in my armchair pretending to read, but behind the pages of my book, I was a silent observer, a historian documenting the hubris of a tyrant on the brink of a spectacular fall. The eviction notice, drafted by Ms. Albright's formidable team, was a masterpiece of cold legal precision. It was to be served on a Friday afternoon, a time I knew Nicole would be home, likely planning her next move in what she believed was her victorious campaign to oust me. I had arranged to be out of the house, having tea with my sister, providing myself with an alibi and a much-needed moment of peace before the inevitable explosion. The process server, a tall, imposing man with a deadpan expression, had his instructions. My sister Martha and I were just finishing our scones when my phone buzzed. It was a text from the process server. Service complete. A few minutes later, another buzz. It was Nicole. Then another. And another. A frantic barrage of calls and texts that I ignored, my hands steady as I poured Martha another cup of tea. Later, from the safety of Martha's quiet apartment, I listened to the voicemails. They were a symphony of Nicole's unraveling. The first was sheer, sputtering disbelief. Pauline, what is this joke? What is this ridiculous piece of paper some man just handed me? You need to call me back immediately. This is not funny. The second was escalating anger. I've read it again. Are you insane? You can't evict me. My lawyer will tear this apart. This is Randall's house. It's my house. You are a senile, vindictive old woman. The third and most satisfying was the sound of pure, unadulterated panic. Pulling it. I called my lawyer. He looked up the county records. He said the deed. Oh my God. You need to call me. We need to talk about this. This has to be a mistake. A misunderstanding. Please, Pauline, call me back. I deleted them all. When I returned home that evening, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic, furious silence. Nicole was in the living room, surrounded by her swatches and decorating magazines, now looking like the pathetic remnants of a failed campaign. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a hatred so potent it was almost tangible. She rose as I entered, the legal document clutched in her hand. How could you? She hissed, her voice trembling with rage. After everything Randall and I built here, how could you be so cruel? I met her gaze, my own calm and steady. Cruel, Nicole? I said, my voice quiet but each word carefully weighed. Is it cruel to assert ownership of one's own property? I believe cruel is serving a grieving 70-year-old widow an eviction notice from her home of 40 years, a week after she buried her only son. You, my dear, were the one who chose to weaponize the law. You simply misidentified the true owner of the arsenal. She started to stammer, to bluster about Randall's wishes, about her rights as his widow. I held up a hand, silencing her. Randall's truest wish, the one he legally documented years ago, was to ensure his mother would always be safe and secure in her home. You, in your greed and arrogance, chose to desecrate that wish. You saw me as a sentimental old fool, an obstacle to be removed. You were wrong. I walked past her towards the kitchen, leaving her standing there, the eviction notice trembling in her hand. You have 30 days, Nicole, I said over my shoulder. I suggest you spend less time planning my renovations and more time packing. She didn't get to see my smug expression, my own look of a queen moment. She only saw my back as I walked away, but I imagine she felt it. In the kitchen I made myself a cup of tea. It was then I realized I was truly happy, not because I'd hurt her, but because I had reclaimed my life, my dignity. I had stood up for myself and I had won. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept in my own bed, the one in the master suite. The house was quiet. The air was clear. And for the first time since Randall's passing, I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. The battle was over. And my home was once again truly my own. The 30 days that followed were a quiet, satisfying countdown. Nicole, stripped of her arrogance and faced with the unassailable truth of the deed, was a ghost in my house. The imperious commands were replaced by a sullen silence, the sneering condescension by averted gazes. She spent her days on the phone, her voice a low, frantic murmur as she presumably tried to find new accommodations and explain her sudden, spectacular fall from grace to her equally materialistic friends. The decorators and realtors she had so eagerly summoned vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The house on Sycamore Street was no longer a hot commodity. It was the scene of her profound humiliation. She tried to appeal to me a few more times, attempting different tactics. There was the tearful performance of the wronged widow, which I met with stony silence. There was the sudden feigned concern for my well-being. "Are you sure you can manage this big house all alone, Pauline?" And finally, there was the last-ditch venomous threat of dragging this through the courts for years, of tainting Randall's memory. "My lawyer, Ms. Albright, would be delighted to discuss that with your lawyer in court, Nicole," I had replied calmly. "She has a rather thick file on your recent activities, including your initial attempt at a fraudulent eviction. I suspect a judge would find it all very illuminating." That was the last time she tried to threaten me. On the final day, a moving van far less grand than the one she had likely envisioned for her triumphant takeover, pulled up to the curb. I watched from my upstairs study window as her expensive modern furniture, the pieces she had bought to replace my own cherished belongings, were unceremoniously hauled out and loaded onto the truck. She directed the movers with a clipped, angry energy, her face a mask of bitter resentment. As the van pulled away, taking with it the last vestiges of her toxic presence in my life, a profound sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't a triumphant, gloating victory. It was a quiet, deep, and satisfying reclamation of what was mine. My home, my life, my dignity. In the weeks that followed, I began the slow, healing process of making my house my own again. I moved my own furniture back into the master suite. I hung Randall's favorite childhood drawings back on the kitchen wall. I sat in my living room, the one she had wanted to gut, and simply enjoyed the quiet, the familiar comfort of the space George and I had created together. My final act of reclamation was in the room that had been Randall's study, the one he had filled with books on history and philosophy before his own ambitions had taken a different turn. Nicole had never touched it, considering it a dusty, irrelevant space. I spent a weekend carefully sorting through his things, not with the raw grief of my initial mourning, but with a new, tender purpose. I felt I understood my son better now, in a way. His weakness, his desire to please a woman who was so clearly wrong for him, his failure to stand up for his own mother. These were his flaws, and they had caused me immense pain. But his earlier action, that long-ago decision to put the house in my name to protect me, was a testament to the good man he had been, the son his father and I had raised. He had, in a moment of youthful crisis, made a choice to ensure his mother's lifelong security. And that, I realized, was his true legacy, his truest wish. Nicole's greed had been an attempt to desecrate that legacy, and in fighting her, I had not just been fighting for myself. I had been honoring my son's deepest, most loving intention. I created a small, beautiful memorial for him in that study. His favorite books, his university diploma, a photograph of him as a smiling, gap-toothed boy. It was a space not of sorrow, but of quiet, loving remembrance of the best parts of him. One sunny afternoon, sitting on my porch watching the new buds on the rose bushes, I thought about the future. The house felt large, yes, but not empty. It was filled with the presence of those I had loved, their memories now safe, protected. And it was filled with my own quiet strength, a strength I had perhaps forgotten I possessed. I had faced down grief, betrayal, and humiliation, and I had emerged not just intact but stronger. I had no desire for revenge beyond what was just, beyond reclaiming what was mine. Nicole's fate was her own to contend with. My victory was not in her defeat but in my own peace. In the quiet dignity of my home, surrounded by the memories of a husband who had loved me and a son whose best intentions had ultimately, belatedly, saved me. I was Pauline Hayes.